Ayato was released to a very mixed reception, often compared to someone like Child, but with more good teams, but an overall lower ceiling. Since then, we've had so many more Hydro 5 stars release, with the likes of Yelan, Neuvillette, and now Furina. The Hydro element, although the best element, is getting extremely crowded at the top. Despite this, Ayato is still one of the most, if not the most, flexible on-fielder in the entire game, despite having that lower power ceiling. So let's talk about if he still holds up, if he's actually obsolete like many say, and how to make the most out of him if you decide he's the right Hydro for you. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Ayato is an on-field Hydro DPS and Hydro applicator. He has a solid amount of off-field Hydro as well, giving him greater synergy with teams that can utilize both on and off-field Hydro. He has a huge amount of flexibility. Hydro has the greatest number of strong reactions in the game, and Ayato can work with all of them. To compensate for this massive flexibility, at Constellation 0, his personal damage is somewhat lower than other on-field characters, preventing from being a top meta unit, but still a casual hero. His huge flexibility gives him good value to players looking to role consolidate, having one character that can allow them to try many different reactions and fun teams. His skill is quite unique as it has a relatively short duration and a relatively short cooldown, which allows you to refresh other units in between skills who have comparable cooldowns, such as Fischl. This unique feature is not able to be utilized to its full potential, however, as most characters fit the traditional once per rotation abilities, thus creating some pretty funky, non-intuitive rotations if you want to maximize him, Bennett being, in my opinion, the greatest defender. His burst has a pretty high energy cost, but he does have a passive that mitigates this, as well as you'll often run him with characters that battery him, such as Fischl or off-field Hydros, which can reduce his ER needs substantially. Overall, he's a very simple and very fun character to use, and although may not burn the brightest in power, shines very well in overall flexibility, so let's talk about his teams. The brand newest team is the Furina teams. I've been really liking Ayato with Furina, Yelan, and Jean. I don't like it as much as I like Raiden on field here, but Ayato being Hydro, providing Hydro particles to both Furina and Yelan allows them to reduce their energy needs substantially. You're able to, if you do your rotations right, which I'm not confident I did, Jean also has a short cooldown, so you can refresh her buff in between his skills, allowing you to get great uptime on Viridis and Venerar, full uptime for all of his damage. And overall, this team just absolutely slaps. Ayato benefits both from Yelan's buff and Furina's buff, and Jean is fully able to help the entire team maximize Furina's stacks as well as VV. So overall, not much to say. Great team, easy to play, can't mess it up. Obviously, he's not the only character that works with this core, but he's definitely a great option. My favorite team pre-Furina was this one here, and it's a relatively free-to-play friendly team, only requiring you to use Kazuha. You're getting what's often called a reaction soup, where you're getting electro charges, overloaded, and overall just a very strong team, and works both in AoE and in single target, although definitely more of an AoE team. It has kind of a weird split rotation, which I'll talk about later on. Overall, I really like it. You can definitely use Ayato in freeze, although it's a step down from other freeze teams in general. That being said, despite this abyss being full of corrosion, I was able to clear it eventually. I do not recommend it for this abyss at all, but in most abysses where there's AoE ventiable content, this team will be incredible. Both Ayato and Ganyu have pseudo-quadratic scaling, which means that they synergize very well when enemies get sucked into Venti's tornado. Because you have incredibly good freeze uptime with Ayato's burst and Ganyu's burst, enemies just stay permanently frozen and permanently locked in Venti's tornado, so you can definitely get away without a healer. That's why I have Shenhe in this last slot, but you definitely don't need to have Shenhe. Rosaria is a great choice, and also more defensive characters such as Diona, Layla, or Charlotte are going to be good here. Of course, you can switch Venti for Kazuha, and you can switch Ganyu for Ayaka if you want to do the Kamisato siblings. The only thing I will say is if you replace Shenhe for someone like Charlotte, then you're going to be much better off replacing Ayato with Furina. So basically what's happening here is it's just not an optimal freeze team, but it is really fun. It does really work. Just again, Corrosion Abyss, yikes for running it without it. Burgeon is a team that he does shine well. You're running Toma on full elemental mastery, Baiju is healing, Nahida has her usual damage build, and then Ayato is here providing the hydro. The off-field hydro he provides is also really nice because as you're doing your setup, you're still able to weave in normal attack and create some Burgeons. Overall, one of the best Burgeon teams. Of course, swap Baiju for Yao Yao, and that's going to work totally fine. Nahida and Toma are pretty much necessary on this. Of course, you can run him on Hyper Bloom. This is never going to be a bad team. Very, very good. I should have mentioned this in the pro section, but Ayato does have some amount of interruption resistance. It's not a huge amount, but it is some, and when stacked with Xingqiu's interruption resistance, that could end up making him feel quite comfy. So I talked about this Farina team. You can replace Yelan with Xingqiu. That makes it even more defensive and more comfy, giving him some interruption resistance. Of course, Yelan will be the highest damaging option, but you don't need Yelan. If you don't have Yelan, Xingqiu is going to be fine. You also can run Fischl in this slot, right? It's not set in stone. There's lots of flexibility here. And of course, you can run triple Hydro. You can run Xingqiu, but by taking out Farina out of a Jean team, you definitely will lose some real damage. As opposed, I'd say she and Jean are not as flexible as the Yelan slot on this. Similarly for this team, you don't need to run Fischl. You can do Xingqiu instead. You can do Beidou. You just need to make sure you run a ton of ER. But yeah, Hyper Bloom never fails. Very good team. You can even switch Xingqiu for Fischl if you need to. You can swap Kuki for Raiden, but losing out on a healer is kind of rough. I definitely prefer Kuki here. Nahida as usual. You can slot in Dendro MC. You can try Baiju, but Nahida is just so good for Hyper Bloom teams. I think if you are going to swap Nahida, changing for Yao Yao or Baiju, as well as changing Xingqiu for DMC to get more Dendro, but the problem is then you're losing out on a bunch of Xingqiu's personal damage, so I would personally stick to Nahida. You can absolutely run him on Nilou teams. I love Ayato on Nilou teams. When there's just an AoE Abyss, you could be hard pressed to find a better AoE team. Of course, there's no grouping on this team, but Ayato's burst is very large, and so is Nahida's. And his slashes are actually quite large as well. He has a pretty darn large AoE. Another pro for Ayato overall. Overall, one of the most comfy, one of my favorite Nilou teams that there is. When there's just pure AoE, it's just fantastic. It pretty much does require Baiju. I don't think Yao Yao gives enough healing. I suppose you can switch into Yao Yao and run around during his skilled cooldown time. So actually, I think that actually could work. So it's not like Baiju is 100% required, but it is much nicer to use him with Ayato than someone like Yao Yao. You definitely need at least Yao Yao or Baiju for sure. I actually really love Ayato Taser. The interruption resistance you get from Xingqiu, Beidou, and Ayato is pretty much indestructible. Like there is nothing that can get through those, and the damage mitigation is enough that you don't need to run a healer. This is a great team. I love this team a lot. You can even run Ayato on Thundering Fury artifact set to get more consistent and higher uptime on your skill. I haven't personally done that, but I've seen it done. It's really cool. I love this team. I really do. It's not by any means the very best version of Taser. I think the Sucrose version with Fischl is very good. You can replace Beidou with Fischl on this team as well. So it's definitely not the highest damaging Taser team. Also running Kokomi instead of Ayato and then running Fischl instead of Xingqiu is a great option. The issue with Hydro characters is that they're so flexible that there's always so many options. Like Ayato doesn't have any teams that are super unique to him except for maybe arguably the Burgeon team, but even then it's like you can use Xingqiu and Burgeon as well. It's just that Ayato has more AoE. But I love this team. You need to run Beidou on a lot of ER. You need to swap into her and use multiple skills per rotation. But it's really strong and I'm a big fan. You can also run Ayato National. This team, you're going to rely on Zhangling's Guoba Swirl. It's basically at the moment that Guoba shoots out his fire, you're swirling with Sucrose to get a double swirl between Hydro and Pyro. It doesn't really work as well with Kazuha, so you really actually do want to use Sucrose on this team, but then you lose some grouping. Overall, not by far my favorite version of the national team, but a very strong one nonetheless. If you need both Pyro and Hydro for some Abyss, then it's a really great choice. One that I didn't expect to like as much as I do is Hyper Ayato, where it's basically that soup team we had before, but you're replacing Fischl with Yunjin, and you're just giga buffing Ayato. And I actually found it performed really nicely. I was surprised with how much I liked it. It's a team that a lot of people will maybe dog on for not being optimal because one of Ayato's best qualities is the Hydro application they gives, and Yunjin obviously doesn't react with Hydro at all, so it's kind of weird. But if you want to see big slashes, if you want to see big numbers, and you want to see the Abyss get melted pretty easily, this is a great team. I like it a lot. Of course, these are far from the only teams you can run with your Ayato. There's plenty more. Let me know in the comments what teams you like the best. But let's go into his build guide next. So for his build guide, in general, Ayato is a character that you can definitely afford to leave at level 80. I would fully ascend him for those talent levels and for the crit ascension stat. The only time you need to go level 90 is if you're using him in a Nilou Bloom team. That is absolutely a must. If not, you can definitely get away with 80. Obviously, especially if you're using Hyper Ayato or you just want him to do the most damage possible, level 90 is ideal, but it's definitely lower on the totem pole in terms of priorities. For talents, the skill is definitely the most important, unless you're just using him as a burst bot. That's something that people do, but you're definitely getting most of your damage out of your skill, so prioritize that. You can completely skip the normal attacks entirely. For weapons, it's pretty much what you'd expect. His signature, the Huron, is his best weapon, but the Jade Cutter is very close. It's like a 2% difference, something like that. His best 4-star is the Black Sword. He synergizes extremely well with the passive. And regenerating some HP is really nice, especially on those teams that are healerless, like that Beidou Xingqiu team. You actually can mitigate, especially if you get high refinements of the Black Sword. It's a really nice option. He gets a lot of crit rate. It's definitely his best battle pass option. The other battle pass option does not contribute to his skill's damage, so you definitely want to go for this one, because his skill actually counts as normal attack damage, not as skill damage. So things that buff his skill, like the new Golden Troop artifacts, that don't work with him. If you want things that affect normal attacks, because his skill counts as normal attacks for some reason. The Lion's Roar is a really great choice. If you have R5 and you're using him in a team where the enemies are affected by Pyro or Electro, the Lion's Roar is it's right on par basically with the Black Sword, maybe just a bit below. It gives a ton of damage percent at R5. It's really good. The only thing you want to keep in mind is if you're using like Hyper Ayato or if you're using Nilou, then this is not a good choice for him at all. Amenoma, also a good option. It's his best free-to-play craftable option. It also reduces his ER needs. The Ishin is also a decent option, but generally worse than the Amenoma. But if you don't have the Amenoma refined, or you've already used your bullets on something else, then the Ishin is a pretty solid option. I want to make sure I throw Favonius up there, because if you're using him in a freeze team where he's mostly there for his burst, I think Favonius is his best choice for a team like that. Or if you're really just trying to take advantage of his burst to use with whatever you're doing, then Favonius is a really great choice. Similarly, the Skyward Blade is also really good if you need lots of ER, and it also gives him some crit rate and increases his attack speed, so it has pretty good synergy with him. If you need this ER, then it's one of his better weapons for sure. Harbinger of Dawn, also good but impractical, and if you have the Summit Shaper, which I don't, it's pretty solid, better than the Amenoma, but not as good as the Black Sword or other 5-star. For artifact sets, the Heart of Depth is actually his best set. He really appreciates the damage percent. If you happen to have a good set from Nymph Stream, it's also very good, but not quite as good as the Heart of Depth. It's also not quite as good as the Gladiators set, which is my set that I'm using for him. Gladiators is a set that you'll be getting a lot of because you're farming a lot of bosses, the weekly bosses, the Ascension bosses. You're going to get a good Gladiator set one day, so that's generally the set that I'm going to recommend. It's very close to the Heart of Depth as far as best set, and I think it is slightly ahead of the Nymph Stream. You can also use a two-piece, especially again if you're not using him in a hyper comp. Two-piece is going to be a great choice, but eventually you're going to get a 4-piece Glad, so that's kind of what you want to work towards if you're not farming Heart of Depth, which there's no real reason to, like for a 1 or 2% difference, it's not worth it. If you're using him with Farina, of course, the Mariachi Band is going to be incredible for him, because not only does he benefit from the HP change stacks and the crit rate, but he's getting that normal and charge attack damage bonus, which is really good for him. That's actually synergizes with his kit. So this is definitely the set that you want to use if you're using him with Farina. The one thing you want to consider though is that it's very easy to overcap on crit rate. That being said, I actually am using a crit rate mask, so I think you can do it. I think you can definitely get a Mariachi Band artifact set, but yeah, you just have to be careful not to overcap on crit rate. I didn't mention the Mist Splitter. The Mist Splitter is just behind the Jade Cutter, so it's his third best weapon. Yeah, my apologies on forgetting that earlier, but the Mist Splitter gains some value in the Mariachi Band artifact set because of that chance to overcap on crit rate, but still at the peak, the other two are going to be better. For main stats, you want to go with Attack Sands, Hydro Damage Goblet, and Crit Mask. You can go Attack Goblet with Farina, but it's not quite as good. Whatever, you have better substats though. I don't like switching artifacts around, so I'd rather just stick with Hydro Damage bonus. If you're running him in a Nilou team, you can go for Elemental Mastery, and put him on Gilded Dreams or something, but I actually prefer just to stick with a normal damage build. Maybe give him an EM weapon, or maybe give him an EM Sands or something like that as like a hybrid build. But between the Nahida buffs, between maybe having Instructor artifact set, if you happen to have the key, you get enough EM that I'd rather just have him on crit so that he can finish off those lower HP targets or deal with the single target chambers better. And again, I don't like switching artifacts, but it is technically optimal to get some more EM on his pieces if you're using a Nilou team, especially if you don't have the key, and especially if you're not using Instructors. But if you're using the key, you're using Instructors, Nahida gives you 200 EM, Instructors gives you 150, that's already 350. If you have some subs, that's already 400 EM. Maybe you give them an EM Sands or an EM weapon, and you run a hybrid build, now you're looking at another 150. So I think I'd rather run him for damage mostly, but up to you. Both are going to be good. For energy recharge, I tend to run a lot of Favonius on my teams, so I tend to be pretty comfortable. I'd say 105, that's what I have, is just below what I would really want. I feel like 109, like 110 energy recharge would be fine for me as like a general baseline. I know most people say that he needs more than that, but again, it's because I run him with, like, I'm not talking about this team. With this team, you need no ER. But in like the Fischl Bennett Kazuha team, Kazuha's on ER, Fischl's creating a lot of energy. 110 is going to be enough, but to be safe, you might want to aim for 120. If you're using him on teams with Burgeon and stuff like that, and he's the solo Hydro and you're not running Favonius, you might need 140, 150 ER. On Freeze, like on Freeze, he needs ER, like, because you're not, yeah, on Freeze, I like Favonius on him. So as usual with ER, you have to play around it. You have to figure out for yourself what's going to work for you, but generally between 110 and 160 ER is what you're going to need. It's a big range, but it depends on the team. For gameplay tips, he is overall pretty straightforward, and I don't think there's much to talk about, but I did want to give you the rotation for his soup team in case you're confused. So you want to open the rotation with your burst, then you want to use Fischl's skill, then you want to swirl them both with Kazuha's skill, then you want to use Ayato's first skill. Once he runs out of his skill, you want to swirl with Kazuha again, use Bennett's skill and burst, switch back to Kazuha for his burst, then switch back to Ayato for his skill again. And if you do it right, he'll finish his skill at the very end of Bennett's burst. You can use Ayato's burst, and Ayato's burst actually snapshots the buff. So it snapshots Bennett's buff here, and when you use Ayato's burst here, then you're restarting the rotation. You're going back to Fischl using her skill, going back to Kazuha using his skill, going back to Bennett using his skill and burst, using Kazuha's burst, sorry, not his skill, his burst, then back to Ayato for the rotation again and use his burst. So that's the rotation. It's a little bit weird. Once you get it, it pops off. This team is great. So versus others, power level, value. To a new player, I think that Ayato has a decent, if not, like, depending on how you define value, may have a low amount of value. If you define it one way, he may have very high value. He is a Hydro character that, I truly believe this, you could pick him up and never get another 5-star Hydro and never want for a Hydro character that does the job. He does everything. Any team that you can think of, he does it. Does he always do it the best? No, but the parts where he's not as good, like you have Xingqiu. So between him and Xingqiu, like you have your off-field Hydro, you have your on-field / off-field Hydro. You can do anything. You have your AoE and you have your single target. You don't need anything else. That being said, he's not the strongest Hydro. That belongs to, I don't know, Farina, to Yelan, to Neuvillette. I don't know what they're doing. They're making so many strong Hydros. Like Neuvillette and Farina are definitely higher up than Ayato on the tier list. Like if you have Farina and Neuvillette, then you don't need to get Ayato. Like he is a terrible pull in terms of value. And that's the thing. The more Hydro characters you get, the lower value Ayato is. And this is what happens with characters that rely on flexibility versus a niche. Characters that rely on a niche often stay as like the premier option forever. But a character like Ayato, the more good Hydro characters come out, the less you need him. That doesn't diminish how good he is. That doesn't diminish how strong he is and how good his teams are and how flexible he is. But the fact that now you have Farina doing some AoE Hydro, you have Neuvillette Novelet doing AoE Hydro? Yes. Novelet, Novelet, there are some areas where Ayato shines over Novelet, like Nilou team. Like, I think that Nilou Ayato teams are some of the best Nilou team, especially for AoE, but like certain types of AoE. But Novelet overall is just a much stronger character. Yes, you can't really use Novelet the same way in Burgeon. Like, Ayato's Burgeon teams are probably better, but Novelet's got better hyper teams. He's got better other types of teams. So, sliding scale of value, sometimes great value, sometimes low value, depends how many other Hydro characters you have, but he does consolidate them. So if you like building lots of teams, and also for the overworld, right? He doesn't rely on anything except for using his skill. He's a great overworld character. He's very comfy, he's very easy to play. There's lots of great positives for Ayato, but definitely he's not ceiling power. So if you're into meta, he's not for you. But if you like him, like, I think that people who love Ayato should be very happy with how flexible he is. Like, no matter what abyss that you want to take him to, he's got a bajillion team. Like, you can find him a great team with any character. He has so many synergies and so many characters that he can work with. Like, Ayato lovers are winning because he just has so many good teams, and he's always going to work in the Abyss. There's never going to be an Abyss that's bad for Ayato, because you just switch up his team and all of a sudden he's ideal for the Abyss. For future prospects, I think that there's definitely a possibility that we get more characters that benefit from this pseudo quick swappy playstyle. The biggest thing that draws him back is when you use him with Bennett, because he's attack scaling, right? And you use him with Bennett, like, he does have some HP scaling in him, but it's not really very big. It's not worth building around. When you use him with Bennett, you can only get Bennett's burst for half of his skills. So that's kind of weird. If Bennett lasted longer, or if you could recast Bennett's burst sooner, like, Ayato value would shoot up. Like, his power would be much higher. So, like, I don't know if we're ever going to get anything like that, but if we do, then I think Ayato stock could actually rise. Other than that, like, yeah, just teams that just other characters that are more synergistic with his cooldown is the main thing that he needs. And is Genshin going to do that? Probably eventually. They release a lot of characters, but I definitely wouldn't pull him expecting future characters to make him better. Most likely he'll get new synergies just from new off-field DPSs and characters, of which other characters like Novelet will also improve from. So I do think there's good potential for him to improve, but it's definitely not a guarantee. For vertical investment, Ayato has great vertical investment options. Obviously, it's not going to be as good value as getting like Farina C2 or Nahida C2 or Raiden C2 or something like that. Raiden C2 being lower than the other ones I mentioned. But Ayato gets a pretty solid boost, something like a 20-24% boost to it from his weapon over the Black Sword. And his Constellation 2 gives him another 18%. His C1, not as great because it's only against 50% or less. It's not a universal increase. But his C1 is a nice increase. And by the time you get to his C3, he's doing almost 40% more damage than he was at C0, so he really truly becomes a very viable hyper carry once you get to C3. It also improves his HP scaling. You still don't want to build HP, but it improves it. By the time you get to the higher constellations, C5, C6, he's doing almost double damage as he was at C0. He's got some very, very high value constellations, so I think C3 is the best stopping point, but realistically C0 is the best stopping point because he's still a great character that will carry you through the Abyss even at C0. But I think it's nice to know that if he is your favorite, he has great constellations that you can dive into and go further into than some characters who have bad constellations. Like, his will feel worth it. Finally, for overworld and aesthetic, he's one of the best overworld characters. Like, really, really, really is one of the best. He doesn't need ER. He's just got damage on demand. Huge synergy of teammates. You can use him with anyone. Just fantastic overworld character. I think people like that a lot about him. A lot more overworld friendly than someone like Child. And for aesthetic, I think he looks good. He's not my favorite design, but he feels good to play. I think he could be a little bit more dynamic, like you kind of are standing still while you're doing the slashes. It could be nice if you could dash around a bit and do some dodges and he was a bit more mobile somehow. But I think he is really fun exactly how he is. Great character overall. He's not a character that you pick up to make your account stronger, but he is a very solid character that you can be happy about if you love him. Plus, he's on a really great banner. Check out the banner guide right here where I review the banner and talk about how good it is. It is a cracked banner. If you're gunning for Ayato, you are winning. Check that out. Bye for now.